Hi, and thank you for tuning in today. My name is Seth Curson. I'm Program Director for K-12 Education here at the National Governors Association. Today, I have the honor of interviewing Dr. Paul Manna of the College of William and Mary on his new hot off the press report entitled How Can State Policy Support Local School Districts as They Develop Comprehensive and Aligned Principal Pipelines? Please note that this recording is the latest in a series of 10 other NGA webinars and podcasts on school leadership hot topics, including with the American Institutes of Research, Education Commission of the States, New Leaders, the Learning Policy Institute, nationally recognized school leadership experts, Dr. Steve Tozer and Dr. Jackie Wilson, as well as governor's policy advisors and state education chiefs from Delaware, Louisiana, and Tennessee. You can find these webinars and podcasts at nga.org. Please also look out for our next recording with Dr. Constance Lindsay of the University of North Carolina School of Education in the coming weeks. These podcasts are supported by and in partnership with the Wallace Foundation. The Wallace Foundation works to support principal and school leader preparation, development, and support across the country. Their Wallace Knowledge Center has multiple resources, tools, and reports on state strategies for school leadership, including Dr. Manna's new report. You can find these resources at wallacefoundation.org or through a direct link on the NGA website. With that, let's dive into the conversation with Dr. Manna. So Dr. Manna, I'd just like to start with your background, a little bit about how you came to focus on school leadership in your career.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Also, let me just say thanks for the invitation, Seth. It's also always great to have a chance to chat with you and the folks out there doing work on these topics in the governor's offices. So my background, how did I come to this stuff? I'm on the faculty, as you said, at William & Mary. I'm in the government department, and I'm also the director of our public policy program. And so a lot of my work over the years has always been, kind of grounded in practice and what people are actually doing in the field. The policy side of me really kind of pulls me that direction. And so the things that have interested me over the course of my career have been within the policymaking process. It's been actually how policies get carried out. So that implementation piece. And so it's drawn me into different, classes that I've taught and different things that I've taught my students, but also education is the main sort of policy area where I focus that work. I think in part because in a previous life, I used to be a teacher. I was a high school teacher for a few years before I went back to graduate school. I'm also married to a teacher and I have a son who goes to public school. So these are more than just academic matters for me. And then why principals in particular, I think, every professor is always trying to look for topics that are maybe overlooked by others that maybe merit more attention than they get. And my interest in policy implementation and bureaucracy really sort of pulled me into this when I learned more about it from the Wallace Foundation, and they asked me to do a few things. It started to spark my interest because these principals really are some of the most important, on the ground people who are going to make or break policy. A lot of times it's going to work or not work as a result of their efforts. It's not completely up to them, but they have a lot of power over how these things turn out.
Well, thanks, Dr. Manna. It's always good to hear the practitioner and personal lens that you bring to the work. And you said, that principles are important. That's what drew you to the work. You started to look at the research. Can we dig into that a little bit? And can you talk about why are principals so critical for student, teacher, and school success? And how have you seen the role of the principal evolve over time? So why should governors care about principals in particular and invest in school leader development and support?
Absolutely. It's a great question. Great place to start. So principals are really important people who contribute to the success of schools. And there's a lot of evidence. I'm going to talk in sort of generalities, but really everything I'm saying is backed by a lot of great research and studies. And I know you've steered folks to these things in the past, and you'll continue to. One of the things we know about principals and we know about leaders in all kinds of organizations is they're really important for establishing positive cultures. And in school, what that means is they establish cultures where there's an expectation and an excitement about the work, right? There's an expectation that we're here to be learning, pushing ourselves in positive ways, reaching our potential. And that goes for students in schools, but also teachers and staff, right? And so principals are really essential for helping to set that kind of tone in a building. We also know that principals are essential for recruiting and mentoring and keeping outstanding teachers. When you look at surveys of teachers, why do they leave the profession or why do they leave a school? Often one of the main reasons is because the school that they worked in was dysfunctional, leadership wasn't supportive, these kinds of things. So it ties in directly to classroom instruction really there, because if principals are able to keep great teachers and support them, things are going to be happening all over the school that are going to be great. We also know that, and this gets into a little bit of your question about how has the job changed. Really over time, there's been a layering. That principal's desk has gotten stacked higher and higher and higher with more things to do. I think back in the olden days, we'd think of principals as sort of the manager of the school, the budget, make sure the doors are open on time, respond to requests from central office, etc. All those things are still there. Like the principals still have to do all that stuff that we kind of consider mundane sort of management things, but they also do other things now, right? They're more involved in setting expectations for learning. They're more involved in helping to implement more complex policies that come at the school. They're more involved in observing teachers, mentoring teachers, evaluating teachers, and the best principals really invest a lot of time in that because they know it can be very impactful. And also because there is so much work for principals to do nowadays, they have to also spend time assembling leadership teams within the school. They can't do it all. And so the concept in the literature that you often read is the phrase distributed leadership. Principals are ultimately that leader at the top of the pyramid in a school, but the good ones really surround themselves with other people, and they give other people opportunities to lead, be it on curriculum, other kind, school improvement, other kinds of things that schools do. Principals can't do it all. And again, if you want an excellent leadership team, you need a principal who knows how to pull that kind of team together. It's not just, I'm going to invite my friends to do it, give them the extra $1,000 stipend. They really want, the best principals are going to find the right talent to occupy those roles. And so these are a lot of reasons why, and evidence supports, all these things that say why principals matter a lot. Governors should care about these things for some reasons that maybe are obvious, but worth drawing out. One is investing in principals is a high leverage investment because principals touch on so many things that happen in schools. If we can make sure we have great principals, then that's going to ripple across schools in all these important ways. And again, there's a lot of great evidence that shows this. We also know that in some of the most important areas that we're focusing on now, especially things like equity, racism, treating students fairly in school, helping get students the help they need, especially amidst the ongoing pandemic. Like, you cannot respond to those things effectively. You cannot have the difficult conversations you've got to have in schools and with parents and with, community members without great principals leading schools. And so this is another reason why I would call this a high leverage investment. And then finally, I would say just to governors, like, look around, look at other professions, look at the military, look at business. These fields invest heavily in developing leaders. And in fact, we'd be shocked if we didn't spend a lot to develop leaders in those areas. And so it's no wonder that education is an area that benefits from that kind of investment too.
That's great, Dr. Manna. And I that idea that it's not principals, the shifting from managers to instructional leaders, but managers and instructional leaders. So just adding on top and being this force multiplier, as you were saying, for not only student impact, but teachers, the working additions that happen in a school, creating that environment for students and teachers to succeed.
Absolutely.
I want to dig a little bit just into the report. I mentioned this earlier on the webinar, but earlier this month, you released a new report for the Wallace Foundation. How can state policy support local school districts as they develop comprehensive and aligned principal pipelines? It's an update to your groundbreaking 2015 report, Developing Excellent School Principles to Advance Teaching and Learning, Considerations for State Policy. What do you think has changed the most in those intervening 6 years between the reports when it comes to principals and school leaders?
Yeah, I think one thing, it's, again, like maybe too obvious to say, but we've had a global pandemic for going on 2 years now, right? And so what that has done is really put a massive magnifying glass on all of the sort of underlying challenges and difficulties and opportunities, really, in some ways that have been confronting schools, and principals are often at the center of many of those things. And so really it's added to that layering that we were just talking about a minute ago. And it's also, I think, given principals a chance to, in many ways, like get creative. They've had to, when school district offices are struggling to figure out how to mobilize an entire district, principals and their leadership teams were doing all that kind of work on the ground. And so I think this has, put a spotlight or a magnifying glass on these ongoing stressors. But I think it's also helped us to see some other things about schools that maybe we can take in a positive sense, right? Recognizing those community bonds that we have, like, mobilizing neighborhoods and communities to help principals and help schools do what they need to do. I would suspect that a lot of principals really saw some great teachers step up as potential future leaders of schools, maybe people who might have been a little quiet or flown a little bit under the radar. You see them in action in this moment, and maybe especially with particular constituencies in the school. Hopefully those people will then get groomed and, brought along, and districts will recognize that talent also, listen to what principals are saying. So I think that's one thing that's changed a lot. The other thing that's changed a lot, and, you referenced that report from 2015, which, if we think about publication dates, we know anything published in 2015 is really based on research and information gathering that happened a couple of years before that. So really, we're almost 10 years past that. And it's incredible, the explosion of research on principles and our ability to speak with much more confidence now about these connections between what principals do and what students learn. And how well teachers perform, right? Like we had research on this before, but the volume of the research and the research using different modalities as well. So not just case studies of particular schools or leaders, but larger studies that are based on experimental or quasi-experimental designs, where we can really get more into trying to assess causal effects of principals' work. Like, we have a huge range of stuff now that we can turn to when we try to decide what to do for principals, how to support them, how to craft policy. And so it really is a great moment for people who are interested in this work, because we know so much more now with much more confidence. We thought we knew a lot of things like 10 years ago, but now some of these things we just know with much more confidence. We can act with more precision in policy and other kinds of things.
Yeah, it's really helpful to just a sense of how this has made an impact, and then we have some exemplars. And I think the power of both reports has been that you've laid out a series of levers that can be used by states to empower school districts to develop and support principals and school leaders. So can you talk a little bit about those specific levers and how governors can, in that traditional role, being able to coordinate different agencies and from the state to school districts, how to pull those particular levers to make the most impact?
Yeah, I've been talking about these things for a while now, and one thing that is important to remember is these levers, sort of how they show up, who has a say over them, what they can do. It really varies a lot by state, right? Our whole arrangement of education governance across the country is highly variable given the way that we run education in the US. We don't have one national system, right? We have 50 systems really. And then we have a bunch of local adaptations to those 50 systems. And so, you know, in listing out these levers and in talking about them, one of the things that is just important for, you know, advisors and governors' offices and for governors themselves to get a handle on is, all right, where is the center of gravity for these levers, right? Because in some states, a governor's office might have quite a bit of say. Maybe they've already taken some initiatives. In other states, it might be a state board of education that really wields a lot of authority. Other states have, you know, even separate boards from that, like professional standards boards or other things that weigh in. And so, like, part of getting your head around this as a person working in a governor's office is just to draw out the mental map of where all this stuff lives in your state. And then you can start to be a force for coordination and for making, you know, incremental and then hopefully more, you know, larger improvements. But really, just so that's, I think, an important backdrop to have in mind when you think about these levers and how they work and how they might make an impact. But if you think about what they are, we've got this sort of range of things, right? And so setting principal standards is a really important one that often is central to everything that comes after. All states have done that, right? Not all states use the standards, you know, with great impact. In some places, I'm sure they're just binders or PDFs that, you know, binders that sit on the shelf or PDFs that sit on a website, and they're not really referred to and used and baked in to the other work, but it doesn't always have to be that way. So know that every state has these, you know, and it's a great place to start if you're thinking about a place to dive in. Then there's the issue of recruitment of people into the profession, and then the next step of principal preparation, so that we often think of the recruitment piece as a more locally oriented piece, right? Like districts needing to staff buildings. But there are roles that states can play in this, right? States can host events or convenings, or they can host, you know, like some states do, they host these sort of principal development, you know, weeks or weekends over the summer where they bring in people, get them together, try to get them excited about the principalship. You know, these are sort of low cost, potentially high win types of things. And then there's the principal preparation program part. Like, oversight of principal preparation programs is massively important, massively complex, right? Universities can't offer degrees or certifications without state approval. And so this is where the formal policymaking and oversight authority of states comes in on that preparation. Similarly is the lever of licensing for principals. And so what are the expectations for licensing? Do state policymakers create these licenses as sort of box checking exercises? Or do they put more into it? Is it really more about, you know, learning and getting ready for, you know, showing that you have skills that are relevant for practice? And again, there's huge variation across the country in how licensing works. And licensing also involves relicensing, because, you know, in states, typically when you start, you have an initial license, and then every several years you have to renew it. And so again, when the state sets policy and sets expectations for license renewal, what does that look like? Are they steering principals towards meaningful activities, or does the policy just create an incentive to say, oh, just go grab 30 credits of something? You know, whether it's coherent, whether it's connected to problems of practice, we don't care, just put in the time, right? And states have a say over how they want to steer people into these kinds of things. The last two get into other, you know, once principals are on the job, this idea of supporting principals through professional development. And this is another area where it's often gets sliced from state budgets or state initiatives because it's perceived as being expensive. But really, there are some low-cost things that states can do. They can be conveners of information. They can be switchboards for information, right? Get good idea, collate ideas, get them out to their school districts and to their principals and to their preparation programs. This is especially key in states where there are a lot of rural school districts, and pretty much every state, except for a very small, maybe Connecticut is mostly urban, right? Washington, D.C., not a state, but an urban, unit. But pretty much every other state you can think of has a relatively large number of rural districts. Really hard for them to do professional development or support it because there just aren't as many principals in those districts, right? And so again, if states could provide convening functions, could help steer their districts towards providers of professional development that are known to give high quality professional development, right? Unfortunately, a lot of these activities are not very good. It's organizations out trying to make money because they know principals have to do this stuff. And so some vetting that the state could help do could go a long way, especially towards those rural districts that just don't have the capacity to vet these kinds of things on their own, or they even might not be able to get a good vendor to come and do professional development because they're such a small market. But again, if a state could sort of bundle or create these communities of practice across districts through the switchboard function, that could open up those opportunities. And then lastly, the last lever is about evaluation of principals. Another hugely important one here, because we know that the research literature shows that evaluating principals is not like evaluating teachers, right? It's a different sort of set of issues that roll into the evaluation of principals. And so to make sure whatever systems are in place are attentive to those complexities of the job, if everything is just reduced to simple metrics like student achievement gains, and if it all boils down to that, that's really not that's not a great way to evaluate a principal. It's not a great way to evaluate anybody really, but those problems with evaluation become magnified when they are for principals when they're very reductionist, right? We know across for teachers, principals, other folks, you and me, when we're evaluated in the jobs we do, multiple measures really are important. Certain things matter a lot, and we can weight those things, but we should account for the totality of the work. So it's important to be attentive to that, and also important to be attentive to the incentives that state policy creates in evaluation, right? So if you think about it, some places are very good at identifying talented principals and figuring out which schools they would be great principals to lead. And some principals just have a knack for working, for example, in very difficult environments, sort of what we call turnaround environments, maybe where schools have really struggled and we need to try to get them on a better trajectory. But if the state evaluation system creates incentives for people to avoid those kinds of assignments, right? If just being in that kind of a school is going to necessarily drive down your evaluation because it's going to take maybe many years to get the school back on a good trajectory, the evaluation policy of the state deters potentially great principals from taking on those assignments. And we want to, again, recognize that some assignments are more difficult than others, and maybe people could even be rewarded for stepping up to the challenge in some way and have that baked into the policies that states craft when they do evaluation. So again, these are the kind of the key levers that I've identified in that other report that you referenced. And I think it's important for states to just, start somewhere. It's a lot to bite off all at once if you're trying to figure out how to get going on this work, but find a place to start, ground the work in standards, and then see how you can move it forward. That's one of the interesting things from the research on these levers is not every state starts in the same place. Not every state has the same institutional leader on these things. In some states, it might be the governor, it might be a state chief, it might be someone not even in the government. It might be a, like a principal development program leader at a university becomes a real big spark plug for a state. Might be someone who's interested in leadership in the business community or some other, in the civil rights community, who calls attention to this. So leadership and energy can come from lots of different places around these levers. And so I think the point is just to be open-minded and be willing to work with people on them.
Dr. Manna, and I think that's a really great point of just starting with that gap analysis and sort of an asset scan in your state. And I thought that was particularly well done in this recent report where you recognize the different state contexts, the state governance systems, like you mentioned, and a series of posed questions that a state can try to figure out where the best way to move, where there's momentum, where there are actors in place to be able to move the stakeholders that you need and the levers that you can push at this particular time. Go ahead.
And I was just going to say, if I could add, I mean, that's one of the things, and maybe to a fault, like I've tried to always, in talking about these things, I'm not the one out there doing the work myself, like in these schools and in these state venues. Like, I don't know all the nuance. I don't know all the detail. I don't know all the backstories and context. And so I've always tried to be fairly cautious in saying, this stuff is not a recipe book. It's not, follow step 1 to step 5 and poof, you get, a great cake or a great school at the end of it. These are points for consideration. And hopefully, and this is one of the things I tried to do in the new report, is around these kinds of issues, provide people with some question prompts that are the right questions to be asking when you want to push forward with this work, and especially when you want to push forward in partnership with local school districts to guide this work. So the country is so complex. How we do schooling is so complex. And so I think, people shouldn't pick up any of these reports and look for the answer. What they're going to find are options, considerations, and questions, as you just put it there.
That's great. And I think one thing I just want to stay on with this is, because you mentioned as you went through the levers that the importance of not just the levers themselves, but the quality of the levers, particularly when you're talking about standards. So can you just, give us a few examples? We get this question all the time from governors' offices, who's doing this well, right now, even if they're not doing all 6 or so, in particular areas that you would point to as, state exemplars that can be looked at.
Yeah, I'll give you a few examples, some, and they vary. So I like these because it illustrates some of the variety that's out there. Probably the iconic case of one of the heaviest lifts in this area around principal preparation is what the state of Illinois did over essentially like a 10-year period, where a bunch of different stakeholders with an interest in improving principals and with a knowledge that the current mode of preparing them was not doing the job, mobilized what became a statewide effort. It became legislation. It became policies that elected officials supported, even when some of the elected officials were embroiled in scandal. In Illinois, like, the ideas were so powerful, they still were able to have broad support from constituencies that pushed them forward. And so this was a massive reform to principal preparation. Essentially, the state decided to sunset all of the principal preparation programs in the state, force them to essentially retool, reopen, meeting a new set of expectations, a new sort of menus of degrees that principals could get as a way to just really overhaul principal prep. And I know you've talked with, you mentioned his name at the start here, Steve Tozer. He was one of the folks working right in the middle of all this, and he could tell you, chapter and verse about how it happened and with what result. Like, the results have been quite good when you look at it. And so that's one example of a state that went very aggressively on the preparation, but did it by cultivating broad constituencies from lots of different corners of the state to make it work and to have that sort of center hold. And so this is one example. Another example that's in many ways as powerful, but a little bit more niche, is the case in North Carolina, where you have a principal preparation outfit called the Northeast Leadership Academy at North Carolina State University. NELA is what it's called. And NELA is an interesting case because it also reflects a state, local, university partnership around recruitment of principals, professional, training of principals, and professional development and licensing of principals. And so this is an effort. Bonnie Fuzzarelli at North Carolina State was one of the leaders here, who back about a decade ago, when federal Race to the Top money came out, and many of the people in governor's offices will remember Race to the Top. I know there's some new folks who might not know what that means, so Seth, you can brief them on that. But an infusion of federal funds, states were given some latitude to create plans for how to use it. And in North Carolina, they used a portion of that to stand up the Northeast Leadership Academy, which is a principal preparation program at North Carolina State designed explicitly to serve rural school districts in that northeast part of North Carolina. And so this is a great illustration of the state with its heft through its financing being responsive to great ideas at the university level for preparation, and that university having these partnerships with the districts that it's serving, saying, hey, we could do something really exciting here. And Race to the Top money is long gone, but the idea has persisted, and there's more support for it now, and it's really been this thriving approach for preparing principals to serve in these rural districts. Last example I'll give is a more recent one, which comes out of the state of Tennessee, which again, through a partnership and leadership with the state education department and local school districts and constituencies around the state, pulled together a really terrific publication within the last few years called the School Leader Equity Playbook. And so this builds on the idea of setting standards and identifying good practices and identifying, things that we should be training principals to do. It feeds like directly into professional development and ideas potentially about licensing. But it's basically a book that says, and it's a playbook, so it's meant to be action items, right? You get it and you can see immediately, if I'm a principal and I want to lead with an equity mindset, what are the things I could be doing right now? What are the things I might have to maybe plan for and do, within the next 6 months, and then maybe longer term kinds of objectives. But it's great. It's targeted at principals, but it's also targeted at other leaders. So like superintendents, other folks within the system that, within school systems and across the state. So again, drawing on this idea of standards, and here in particular, standards for equity. What would it look like if leaders were leading with that mindset? What would be the observable behaviors? Looking at, again, the state agency here as a convener of ideas, right? It didn't just send 4 people into a room and have them write this thing and then publish it. It was a convener of knowledge from across the state's, various school districts to try to pull this together. And then ultimately the state puts it out, broadcasts it. So everybody who wants to grab hold of it can grab hold of it. And then obviously follow-up conversations can ensue. You can start organizing professional development or licensing activities around this. Principal prep programs can start to see this and think, all right, how do we maybe build that into our curriculum? So you can see, again, the idea that it's a beginning around an idea, but then it can ripple across these other levers depending on how far state leaders and their collaborators want to push it.
Dr. Manna. And so Illinois, North Carolina, and Tennessee. And what's interesting, and you mentioned that 10-year period in Illinois, is that all of those examples because of their longevity, have really anchored that work across multiple bipartisan administrations, which is so important. We talk a lot here around how do you sustain reforms across administrations, and that those are three examples that you laid out that seem to cross, party and given their longevity across administrations.
Yeah, and I think one of the common features in all this is that it's literally these are real partnerships, right? Like it's people who maybe have some disagreements about things. And I know in Illinois, there were people around the table who had a lot of disagreements about things, but it's trying to, rather than trying to shut out the people who have the different ideas, the strategy is, no, you have to bring them in, because if you want it to be sustained, you've got to be attentive to what some of those concerns are. And obviously the concerns that are brought forward in good faith, right? Some people just try to intervene to kind of, blow up a process and just prevent it from taking hold. But for the people who are really, committed to, the common goal in a way, they just maybe have a different idea about how to get there, and maybe a strongly different idea. You certainly have to bring them in, or else you won't have that coalition that holds when, as you say, like when the politics shift, or when the money goes away, right? And then you have to be creative to figure out how to sustain things with less money. Requires more creativity, requires people to trust one another, to work together in maybe different ways. It's great. I think it's a great point that you bring up there.
Well, thanks, Dr. Manna. And I think, this creating of a space and environment for this work to happen among local school districts. You brought up earlier a little bit the convening function of governors. One of the specific sections of the report I wanted to focus on is what you called state systems of support, and ways that state leaders can use those powers to convene, to elevate exemplars through the bully pulpit, to provide funding and budgetary incentives for local action. Can you provide a little more background on those particular gubernatorial powers, those state systems of support, and where you've seen it used effectively?
Yeah, so let me start with a couple of sort of fairly specific, smaller examples, and then I'll end with a larger, sort of broader one. So a couple of examples here is again, going back to this convening power. You do see around the country examples of this, of governors creating these moments, and they've become these ongoing programs in some places, where they are encouraging local school districts to identify potentially promising principals. So people who aren't principals yet, but who might be thinking about it, right? And so to give them a real serious and I guess excitable introduction to the profession. And so some states, Georgia is an example, Maryland is an example. Governors have created these leadership academies, or these what in Maryland they call the Promising Principals Academy, where there's you create this space to bring people together. You tell the local school districts, hey, we want the 1 or 2 or 3 most promising candidates you can identify, and then we're going to bring those people together, for a week or a weekend or virtually, in sort of hybrid formats, to really get them interested in this role, and to really show that this is important. This is the governor of the state, that's taking, making space for this, that's, sending resources to this. So this is serious stuff, right? This is not just someone's idea in some corner office, right? This is really, it's got the stamp of the highest elected official in the state. So these kinds of things this is one way to imagine this. A governor, this is a classic sort of bully pulpit type action, right? Spotlighting this kind of work with the governor's, name and backing and effort behind it. Another thing that's a bit broader, and some states have done this, is you look at the flexibilities that now exist within federal policy that didn't exist, say, 10 or 15 years ago. So there was a huge talk, a huge amount of talk when the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA, became law. And the question was on the table, it's like, well, we're going to dial back some of the prescriptive expectations of No Child Left Behind. We're going to try to build more flexibility. Like state leaders have said they want it. They've said they're willing, they're ready to act. And well, no surprise, like principals and supporting principals, developing principals, that can be part of these ways that states flexibly use federal dollars. And so there are certain standards that that state actions and local actions have to meet in order to certain standards of evidence they have to meet in order to steer federal dollars towards these activities. And again, going back to what I said at the beginning, there are now massive amounts of evidence on these things that didn't exist. That evidence base did not exist at that volume and at that level of specificity like 10 or 15 years ago. Now it does. And so now it is legitimate to say, supporting principals or recruiting or training excellent principals, this is a core part of school improvement. It's not just training teachers. We still need to do that. It's not just buying, curricular materials. It's not just, doing additional after school tutoring for students who have fallen behind. Like those are all good things to do. And there's evidence that when you do these things well, it does work. But the principalship can be part of that too. And I think because there is this evidence now that shows these things can be impactful in the ways that ESSA, wants federal dollars to be impactful. So again, governors, it varies by state, obviously, but governors have some say over how budgets come together, about how state agencies steer certain funds when they, in the day-to-day sort of operations of state agencies where governors' appointees, have some leadership. And so this is a space where this stuff can be supported if states want to use resources in that way.
Well, thanks, Dr. Manna. Really helpful, and those specific examples around Georgia and Maryland, and we'll try to draw those out in some exemplars as we put out this webinar. I think earlier you talked a little bit about COVID and sort of the impact that has happened in the last 19 months of the pandemic, and so have some of the amplified needs. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit, and something that I think has changed in those intervening 6 years between the reports is we have a lot more of these principal pipelines that have been built at the district level. Did you see sort of those districts that had a better foundation, maybe of having principal pipelines, were they better positioned to address student and staff needs during the pandemic?
I don't know if we completely have the answer to that yet, because it's still early. We're still it seems like the pandemic's been going on for 100 years now, but we're as far as being able to gather the evidence and know for sure. But I mean, great minds think alike. My head is right where yours is on this. I think a working hypothesis would be that the schools that manage to weather the pandemic and still are managing to kind of manage the pandemic the best are probably the schools where you've got excellent principals. Obviously accounting for other factors too, right? Wealth of communities, student population, the depth of student needs, things like this. But if you just look around, there are enough of these anecdotal stories out there of principals getting really creative with community partners, principals being the ones making sure that, kids have backpacks full of food on a Friday, when they go home for the weekend. It's hard to imagine that schools that don't have good principals are weathering this very well. Obviously sort of pockets within schools might be responding well to student needs, but the school as an overall institution, you could really imagine it's going to be difficult if the principal isn't, an excellent principal that it also is getting support. I think that's the other variable, right? Principals who have the support of their districts and who, the districts, trust them to do the right thing, right? There's that working relationship. It's not just bureaucratic oversight, central office to school. It's actually collaborative problem solving, right? Those kinds of environments are going to be the places. And again, I think it's a working hypothesis. I think when enough time has passed and we've been able to do the research, I think we'll see some of that emerge. Regarding the pipeline specifically, though, one thing I think that will be interesting to see is we know right now that there is increasing turnover within schools, right? Teachers deciding to retire or maybe just take a pause from the profession. Principals too, right, have been hit by that. People just feeling too overwhelmed, right? The job just isn't, they just can't do the job the way they want to do it, or the needs are too pressing, without supports. And so in places where there are principal pipelines, those places have the virtue of a long bench of people ready to become principals, right? If you are this idea of comprehensive and aligned pipelines, right, which is a phrase that I use in the paper and that the Wallace Foundation folks use, right? These ideas convey a notion that developing excellent principals or getting excellent principals in school buildings, this isn't something that starts when there's a vacancy, right? When you need to hire someone. Like, this is an ongoing, every year over multiple years of time, and principals who or people who emerge from those pipelines in places where they're the most robust, they don't necessarily become a principal immediately, right? Because a job might not be open for them, but they are prepared, they are supported, they are ready, so that when they get the call, like maybe they get the call in the middle of the year because there's some horrible, a principal falls ill, or there's an accident or something, a person has to leave. They can come in, and now we're in a moment where a lot of people are deciding to retire or leave the profession. Those places that have this pipeline approach that's comprehensive and aligned, they go to the bench. Who's the next person who's gonna step up? I usually avoid sports analogies, but that phrase of like the next person up, the star is injured, who's the next person up, right? The Atlanta Braves right now, we're looking at the World Series. Their best player is injured, hasn't been playing for a long time, and the team has made it, all the way to the World Series because other players have sort of elevated and they were ready to go, when needed. So I think this is also a benefit of this pipeline approach, is you have this ready cadre of people, and you don't have to be scrambling to hire someone at the last minute.
Thanks, Dr. Manna. And it sounds like we still have to do some research here, but it'll be very interesting. I know we're both part of the sort of Wallace Foundation network, but that investment over multiple years in the 6 districts in particular of building principal pipeline seems like a really good pool to draw from and see how that has been during the pandemic, and look forward to reviewing that as it goes forward. As we sort of end up the webinar, just wanted to go back to you and see if there was final advice, a governor that's hearing this, a governor's office, some final advice you might give as they're beginning this work or renewing this work, particularly coming out of the pandemic, that you would want to share.
Yeah, I think a few things, and some of this we've already touched on a little bit, but I would say first, just inviting and encouraging governors and their staffs to bring nuanced thinking to this work and to this discussion, right? I think one of the unfortunate things in some of the literature and in some of the policy conversations is we throw around this term school leader, and it becomes a bit of a mishmash because there are lots of different people implied, when you use the word school leader. Like, is it the superintendent? Is it district office people who work with schools? Is it principals, assistant principals, teacher leaders, community leaders who are on school improvement committees? Like, who is it, right? And so be careful and not, don't think that phrase or that word leader or school leader necessarily is always all that helpful, because these different leaders that I've just mentioned, they often have very different roles and different responsibilities, and the law in particular expects them to do things And for some people, the law says they can't do certain things, right? And so, bringing some nuance to the conversation, and that hopefully can get rolled into the policy making, into the guidance, into the regulations that school districts have to live with that come from the state. So that's one suggestion. A second suggestion is, and governor, this is not just directed at governors in their offices, but really anybody in a policy position, is don't assume that your personal experience in school reflects the typical experience in the schools in your state, right? Governors all went to school, they all have that memory of being in school. And too often we think that our own experiences reflect the sort of the median school or the general set of conditions out there. And it's often incredibly wrong, to make that assumption. So again, recognizing the nuance, recognizing the variety across your state. And then the last point I would make, and it gets into a point you referenced earlier, Seth, about these sort of systems of support and sort of the broader ecosystem that states can help foster, is I would really encourage governors and their advisors not to be, I would say, afflicted or hung up on this common view that that dollars spent on school administration are necessarily wasted, right? There's that common refrain that we want to push as many dollars as we can into the classroom, right? We've all heard it. And we've seen political speeches with that idea, and we've seen, political debates where people talk about getting the dollars into the classroom. That's where it really matters. And I would just push back on that and say, well, maybe, but if the systems that operate and support teachers are flawed or unhelpful, then those dollars in the classroom are not going to be stretched as far as they might be able to be stretched, right? If we can create, for example, good data systems in school district offices that help principals make real-time decisions to support teachers, that's an investment in bureaucracy that's going to really improve things in the classroom potentially, right? But we often think of those things. We often think of, any investment in central office or any investment in principals who are these, the top bureaucrats, so to speak, in schools. It's wasted money, because what really matters is money in classrooms. Now, you can go too far with that. You certainly can't uninvest. You can't take all of your money out of classrooms, and teachers definitely do need support. But just get away from that mindset, and have some careful thinking about it. And again, if you look at other fields, this makes perfect sense, right? The best equipped, Army soldier on the battlefield is going to lose the fight if there's not a good command structure and there's not good intelligence feeding information to that soldier about what to do next or where to rescue people who might need help. It's impossible for the person on the ground to be as good as they need to be, teachers especially, if they don't have those systems of support. And states can really, they have some resources they can use to create those systems. And importantly, governors, this is where you have the political heft. Like, you can stand up and say that, look, a lot of people think it's, not smart to invest in these things. It can be really smart. Here's why, and the governor telling that story, or the governor's education aide telling that story, can really go a long way towards making these kinds of needed investments. And this is part of the systems of support discussion that's in the new report.
Well, thanks, Dr. Manna. Lots of great info. Being attentive to the language and the different roles that different leaders play in the district and state, being open-minded to where you can make the different investments and where those that can make the most impact, whether that's so-called in the classroom or those that have the ripple effect of being able to impact those teachers and students in the classroom. So again, thanks for the great conversation and insights today. Listeners, please note that both of Dr. Manna's reports will be attached to the recording. Please look out for our next webinar with Dr. Constance Lindsay of the University of North Carolina School of Education in the coming weeks. Thanks again, Dr. Manna. And until next time, thanks for listening. We hope you and your family stay safe and well and have a great day.